Okay. So I think this one's controversial because it's poorly understood, is a big piece of it, but it's also culturally ingrained. And there's some interesting research we'll talk about on that. And it's highly emotional because people need a place to live and people want to feel secure. And it's like a basic human need. But I think the misunderstanding thing, the poorly understood thing, a lot of people believe what I would say incorrectly, that renting is objectively financially inferior to owning. Just full stop.
Throwing your
That's
money
it.
away. Rent is
Right.
throwing your money away.
Right. And there's nothing like that. That's it. Renting's a bad decision, period. You can't change my mind. Now that is something that's very hard to change people's minds on. I've tried. Some people do change their minds, like we talked about earlier, Cameron, but many don't. And I am still like I did a recent video on this topic on my YouTube channel that did quite well. A lot of people watched it, and I'm honestly still taken aback at how many people clearly don't watch the video because they'll come to the comments and say, "Well, you didn't talk about this," when it was literally one of the main points of the video. But anyway, I'm still taken aback at how people just they won't hear the counter arguments, but they'll argue their position without even trying to understand what I'm trying to say. The reality, as people who follow our podcast know, is that it's pretty reasonable to expect renting and owning to be financially comparable due to simple equilibrium economics. If either renting or owning were cheap, people would switch to that option up until it stopped being cheap. When you take the total costs of owning a home into account, property taxes, maintenance costs, building depreciation, the opportunity cost of having equity in a home rather than invested in stocks, and the cost of borrowing if you have a mortgage, you typically end up with a figure that looks very similar to what you would otherwise pay in rent. So the total unrecoverable costs of renting and owning are generally similar, and that makes their expected financial outcomes comparable. Now, understanding that takes some thinking. I remember when that first clicked for me, I was like, it was really interesting. Wow, that's so cool. So I started writing about it. But I think a lot of people don't have that click, because they won't take the time to understand it. I don't know. And it if it conflicts with their identity, they may shut off their cognition. So that's one piece. Um, the misunderstanding piece. Uh, I think another big part of the identity piece and just the controversy more generally is that there's a big cultural aspect to homeownership. There are, in many cases, strong cultural motivations to buy a home, and that might have certain status or moral virtue associated with it. Like if your parents pressure you to buy because that makes you a good person, or if it's seen as a prerequisite for dating in a specific culture, you're probably going to buy a home, even if it's a bad financial decision, even if we could measurably show it's a bad financial decision. So there is this 2017 study. This is quite interesting that finds that second generation immigrants to the United States with a father that emigrated from a high homeownership country, like you can look around the world and different countries have very different home ownership rates. Some are really low, some are kind of close to Canada, some are even higher. But if you go and look at this is based on U.S. immigrants. So if a second generation immigrant has a father that emigrated from a high homeownership country, they're significantly more likely to be a homeowner in the United States compared to a second generation immigrant with a father from a low homeownership country. That's not, I mean, that's obvious almost. Like, of course that's true, but it's interesting that there's research supporting it. Now, I mean, I could show people my rent versus buy spreadsheet or Braden's web app all day, and like it's not gonna. You can't math your way out of a cultural belief or a
Culture.
cultural identity, right? You can't.
Well, even if it's more than a specific cultural belief, which to me makes it sound like it has something to do with your, your family, your ethnic identity, whatever that happens to be. I mean, and I know we've talked about this on the podcast before, but this idea that it may very well be that people just get a non-financial benefit out
Mm.
of owning a home. And I think that's pretty clear. Pride of ownership, for example, is a benefit, but it's a non-financial benefit. And it makes sense that people would be prepared to pay a premium to receive that benefit. And that doesn't make it the wrong decision, right? I mean, if you're willing to pay more, maybe you would come out ahead if you rented and invested the difference, but you prefer not to do that because you would rather forego some financial benefit for a non-financial benefit, right? And
That's
that's
me.
just really hard to measure.
That's
Totally.
me.
Yeah,
Well, I
I think
mean,
that's a
we
lot
all
of us, right?
we all own all three of us own our homes, so
Yeah, and not because we think that we're going to get wealthy and our home is an investment and it's a retirement plan and all of that. It's just I enjoy it, right? Like I like to have the pride of ownership. I like the ability to make improvements to the house without, or in our case, condo, without, having to ask a landlord's permission. I'm almost certain that we spend a lot more than we would if we had, but it's just a cost that we're willing to do. It's
Yeah.
like going to a restaurant instead of cooking at home. It's not just a financial decision.
Yep.
So,
It's like, why are the expected returns of gold low? One of the reasons is that people collect an emotional dividend from owning it, which does not give
mm,
you a financial return, but it does give you a non-financial return. Now, an interesting interaction with what we were just talking about is that some research has suggested, this is actually Ellie Bracha, who was on last week, that the non-financial motivations to own a home, like the things that we were just talking about, and the perception that it's a better financial decision than renting, can actually shift the financial equilibrium in favor of renting, which is an interesting concept to think about. Now, their research does, we talked about this with them last week too, but they used an analytical model calibrated to US data and markets all around the US and the US as a whole. And they do find that in their sample period, renting had come out ahead of owning financially most of the time. And so they're kind of saying like it looks like that there are big non-financial motivations that are shifting that financial equilibrium a little bit in favor of renting. Which again, that doesn't make owning or renting better, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Now, having a place to live, like I mentioned earlier, is a basic necessity for people to live good lives, which is probably one of the reasons all of us own our homes. Although I've been very happy renting in the past too. But it's no surprise that this is an emotional topic because it's such an important part of people's lives. The idea of being evicted by a landlord or priced out of a home or neighborhood is scary for a lot of people. And I don't want to minimize that. That's a real thing. And I do think that the ability to hedge the cost of living in a specific home or a specific neighborhood is one of the best arguments in favor of home ownership. There is a really interesting 2024 study that finds in survey data and like economic accounts data for a bunch of different countries that inflation protection is one of the key motivations for people to buy their house, especially after recently high inflation, and that people living in or emigrating from countries with high past inflation are much more likely to buy than to rent. So again, that's a pretty intuitive finding. It makes sense that past inflation experiences would make people more sensitive to inflation risk and therefore more likely to buy a home, which hedges the cost of living in that home. But that doesn't make renting or buying objectively better or worse for someone making that decision today. And people with different past experiences are going to have different perspectives on that. Now, I can say that, but someone who recently left a high inflation country after they were priced out of their rental market would think I'm completely nuts to say that renting can be a reasonable way to pay for housing. And then somebody else from, I don't know, like Germany, which has a relatively high rate of people who rent, they might think that renting is completely reasonable, and they've had relatively low inflation. Past personal experiences are going to shape the way that people see the world, and the fact that people have different past experiences contributes to renting versus owning being so controversial. The last point I want to make on this one is that people are not financial models, and I think people know that. The rent versus own models require renters to save and invest the cash flow cost difference between renting and owning into other assets like stocks. And when they do this in a model, the long-term financial outcomes are comparable. But real people might decide to spend the cash flow cost difference rather than saving it, or they might make bad investing decisions, getting in and out of the market at the wrong times, taking the wrong risks, paying huge fees to own segregated funds or mutual funds or trade options or whatever. So I I think that matters. And people say this all the time. Sure, that might make sense in your model, but nobody's actually going to do that. But the thing is, some people will. Like I know people who have been very financially successful while renting. And I know people who have within their friend group been more financially successful as a renter than their friends who decided to buy homes.
you can definitely make mistakes after both of those decisions, right?
Mm,
I mean, with the homeowner, the mistake is yes, you have the forced savings and you don't have to worry about saving and investing the way that the renter does in order to come out even in that model. But man, we all know people, and maybe we are those people who, bought homes and promptly poured tens of thousands or more into, renovations that maybe enhanced our lifestyle a little bit. But I think a lot of people probably regret some of the money that they spent on their home, and or might find themselves in a position where they have to spend a lot of money on improvements to the house that they get zero enjoyment out of. My favorite is the new roof, right? I mean, it's very expensive. I don't know anybody whose life was enhanced by a new roof unless you were getting wet before. But these are things that you can definitely make the mistakes on both sides, right? Just like it's easy for you to people to say, and they're 100% correct. If you're a renter, you have to be a disciplined saver and investor, and very few people are that. But if you're a homeowner, you also have to resist the temptation to unnecessarily pour lots of money unnecessarily into improvements, which, as much as we love to convince ourselves that when we spend money on our homes, it increases the value, and it can to some limited extent. But I'm sorry, if you spend $50,000 on your house is probably not worth $50,000
Maintains
more.
the value.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah. It's called the investment illusion is what I've heard it been called, that people are more willing to overspend on fixing up their house because they expect to get that value back when they eventually sell. But there's obviously
exactly. They convince themselves that it's not really an expense, it's an investment.
Yeah, that's a really good point though. And people, there's some pretty interesting stories about people who have stripped out all of their home equity over time. Like in Toronto, for example, where the market's just gone up, 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 but you find people who have very little equity because they've borrowed against their home. So you have to be, you got to be disciplined in both cases. That's actually a really good point, Dan. So I think it has to be acknowledged that financially successful renting and owning, as we just talked about, requires discipline and maybe some financial knowledge. But for the right person, renting is a perfectly reasonable way to pay for housing, and as is owning. And I think there are a lot of cases where owning does make sense. Like if you really want to stay in one place, it hedges the cost of that, which is important. And then the other interesting one is that the average person who has low financial literacy and doesn't know a whole lot about investing or financial markets, and maybe doesn't want to take the time to learn about it, owning a home is probably better for them than, trading options or something like that.
Especially they're debt averse. If people are more motivated to pay off debt than they are to build equity, use that to your advantage.
Yeah. I do want to say that I've never been, and I'm not currently anti-home ownership. I do own a home, as we've mentioned. I have spent more of my life renting than owning, and I was perfectly happy then too. But I'm pro rationally assessing housing options, which can mean either renting or owning, depending on the specific circumstances. But I'm reminded every time I create content on this topic that is a controversial take.
But you don't get the same happiness dividend, I think, that I know I do, and maybe you do, Dan, in owning a home, Ben.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And we've talked about it on the podcast before. I'm in an unusual position in that I own a home that I used to rent. So I know exactly what sort of enjoyment we had because the property is exactly the same. And I will say I enjoy owning it more than I did renting it, right? I just do. And is that, again, a better financial decision? Probably not. Condos in Toronto where I live have not gone up in value in about 5 years. So, but it's a place to live that I enjoy. So I'm happy with the decision. That's not a spreadsheet decision, right? So, I mean, I think the key idea here is the idea that renting is throwing money away is the wrong way to look at it. Throwing money away is throwing money away. Renting and saving and investing, the difference is not throwing money away. Buying a home and throwing money away on senseless improvements and ill-advised, renovations is throwing money away. It's independent of the decision of whether you want to rent or buy.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. Throwing money away is throwing money away.